After months of negotiations, Taiwanese fishers held in China are heading home. Corruption scandals involving the Taiwan People's Party and its chair, Ko Wen-je, cast doubts on their political future.
会保证我们一定会继续努力，我们不会被任何挫折击垮的。
Conflicting data raises questions about the well-being of Taiwan's aging population. Plus,
I'm here at Taran International Airport with huge crowds waiting for Taiwan's Olympic athletes to return home.
a warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Brossard. China has released 4 crew members of a Taiwanese fishing boat detained for more than a month after entering Chinese waters. But the boat's captain is still in detention. It's just one of a spate of recent incidents that have raised tensions in the waters between Taiwan and China. Louise Watt reports.
After 6 weeks being held in China, 1 Taiwanese and 3 Indonesian fishers are on their way back to Taiwan. They were taken in a small boat from a port in China to the median line of the Taiwan Strait. That's the unofficial boundary between Taiwan and China and where the handover happened. They were detained by China's Coast Guard at the beginning of July near Taiwan's outlying islands of Jinmen. The Chinese Coast Guard says they were in Chinese waters and they were breaking a seasonal ban on fishing in the area and using illegal fishing nets. Taiwan recognized that the boat crossed into Chinese waters, but it said it was unusual for fishing boats to be treated in this way, and it suggested that the response from the Chinese side was heavy-handed. This is just one of a series of incidents that have escalated tensions in the waters between China and Taiwan. In February, 2 Chinese fishers drowned in Taiwanese waters after being chased by the Taiwanese Coast Guard. 2 weeks ago, their bodies and boat were returned to China. Soon after that, China released a Taiwanese fisher it had held for more than 4 months. So on the one hand, it appears that tensions are easing. On the other hand, both sides have been ramping up maritime security in the wake of these incidents, and Taiwan accuses China of normalizing Coast Guard patrols around Jinmen. And in this incident, although the 4 fishers are on their way back to Taiwan, the captain and their boat remain in Chinese custody, an ongoing headache for Taiwanese officials. Joseph Wu and Louise Watt for TaiwanPlus.
A number of corruption scandals have been dogging former presidential candidate Ko Wen-je and others from his Taiwan People's Party in recent weeks. As Chris Gordon reports, it marks a turning point for a politician once seen as a rising alternative to the political status quo.
我也要向支持者和合作的厂商鞠躬道歉。
A public apology from the campaign finance chief of former presidential candidate Ko Wen-je in response to allegations of corruption. The campaign now says that it misreported expenses totaling more than $500,000. In one example, more than $150,000 were marked as being paid to a public relations company, which the company says it never received. The campaign also failed to report revenue from a concert ostensibly held as a fundraiser, which it now says was a purely commercial event. In total, the campaign says 17 expenses were misreported, blaming the errors on an outside accountant. Ke, a former Taipei mayor and head of the Taiwan People's Party, is standing behind his team.
我们现在所有的支出，你知道，都有凭证，都用在选举相关的事务。更重要的，他没有跑到任何个人的口袋里面。我也保证，我们一定会继续努力，我们不会被任何挫折击垮的。
It's just one of several corruption scandals hanging over the party. Peng Zhengsheng, deputy mayor of Taipei under Ke, has been barred from leaving the country after he and Ke were implicated in a suspicious real estate deal dating from their time in office. It's been a difficult 6 months for a politician once seen as a rising star and disruptor of the country's 2-party status quo.
And so we initially politically debuted in 2014 he framed himself as a beyond blue-green distinctions. And in this way, he benefited from being independent at a time in which the public seemed to hope for alternatives. And so coming up as a new third party in that way, I think that actually was a disruption to the status quo. But at a certain point, he came to be seen as grandstanding on national issues rather than paying attention to very local mayoral issues. And so then his rating fell dramatically.
The TPP's cooperation with the main opposition KMT and its pushing of controversial reforms has seen its popularity plummet. One recent poll showed Ke's Taiwan People's Party with an approval rating of only 6%. Even the party's apology press conference was disrupted by a protester. But just how bad is the political damage from these scandals?
And with Ko as the party leader, if he falls, then that party has no future. And that also does mean an end to his presidential ambitions. But it's also possible that this will become part of his political brand, that the controversy glance off of him, and he will manage to frame himself as being targeted politically by the DPP government in a way that benefits them.
Unpopular and facing criminal investigations, the question is whether Ke and his party, who only recently shook up Taiwanese politics, can put aside recent scandals, or is this latest revelation too much to recover from? Alex Chun and Chris Gorin for TaiwanPlus.
Former Nantou County Chief Li Yu-ting has been sentenced to more than 400 years behind bars for corruption. Li was convicted of taking bribes worth more than $300,000 from contractors in natural disaster relief projects since 2009. After a 12-year trial starting in 2012, the Supreme Court made a final verdict on Li's 111 charges and closed the case earlier this week. Taiwan is home to a growing number of senior citizens who live alone and may need help from social services. But local advocacy groups disagree with the government on how to accurately count their numbers, and they worry some people might fall through the cracks. John Van Trieste reports.
As Taiwan's population ages, the number of senior citizens living alone is on the rise. Though they may have enough money to support themselves, advocates for their welfare worry they may be vulnerable, whether to scams aimed at older people or to accidents like falls. These groups want to make sure safety nets are in place for these older people.
他跟社会跟他的家庭都断裂的话，像这类型的长辈就很可能在第一时间内比较没有人提供这样一个紧急的支持跟协助。
But getting help where it's needed could be tricky. It's not even clear how many of these people there are. While the Interior Ministry counted 670,000 at the end of last year, the Health Ministry only counted 390,000. Health Ministry officials say there are reasons for this big gap, from the way the ministries define senior citizens to the way they gather their statistics.
内政部的那个数字其实是一个纯从户籍登记资料里面做一个统计，卫福部在做的，我们实际上在处理的范围，则是针对独居的长辈他需要关怀的对象的人数。
But welfare groups worry the health ministry may be undercounting. They say there should be only one definition: anyone 65 or older who lives alone. Until then, they worry many in need of social services or care won't be able to get them before it's too late. James Lin and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
An investigation by the New York Times has revealed that China is building new villages along its western and southern borders. It comes as China continues to clash with the neighboring countries over contested boundaries. To learn more about these villages, Adil Brar spoke to Robert Barnett, a senior research fellow at SOAS in London.
Why is China building new villages along its border?
In about 2010, 2012, Chinese scholars who were working on China's northeastern border, Vietnam in the south and Korea in the northeast, began to get nervous about the security implications of what they called the hollow village syndrome, which meant that villagers from border areas were leaving their homes to go and work in towns, something that China's been very much encouraging. And these scholars said this is a security risk. This could let people from across the border come into China. It could spread anti-Chinese ideas and so on. And by about 2016, Xi Jinping himself had picked up this idea and started making border security a major issue, particularly for China's Tibet policy. And so in 2017, the Chinese began this policy of building new villages along the borders of Tibet and also Xinjiang, Yunnan, and other areas as a security measure to strengthen their borders.
Do these villages help China solidify its territorial claim along its border with India?
The villages have some benefit for the military in their dealings with India, in their operations against India. They provide some logistical support, some bases for operation. But actually, it's roads that are most important for the military. And the villages are along roads, but you could have the roads without villages. So this is why some observers are saying that the villages, in terms of India, are really a kind of provocation. They're a kind of psychological, I don't want to say warfare, but they're a psychological tool.
Is there a parallel between China's border villages and Beijing's islands constructed in the disputed South China Sea?
They refer to this as salami slicing, which is what happens in the South China Seas. You progress by a very small move at a time so that the other side can't justify a military response. It's not quite the same on the India border because they're not really so much about grabbing territory with these villages.
That was Senior Research Fellow Robert Burnett from SOS. Taiwan's Olympians have returned home from the Paris Olympics, and among them is boxer Lin Yu-ting, who claimed Taiwan's first gold in the sport on Saturday. Our reporter Sandy Chi went to the airport to meet them.
F-16s welcome a flight carrying Taiwan's Olympic heroes, firing flares in a salute ahead of their arrival. This was just the beginning of the surprises waiting for them at Taiwan's main international airport on Tuesday morning. At the terminal, music filled the air and banners, pictures and cards were prepared for the Olympians. This was the last batch of Taiwanese athletes to return from the Games. The flight carried the country's best in boxing, athletics and table tennis. But at the airport, all eyes were on boxer Lin Yu-ting, who became Taiwan's first ever gold medalist in the sport, after defeating Poland's Julia Szeremeta in the women's 57-kilogram category.
拿到最高的荣誉，展现出我们台湾最强大的力量与精神，是我想要做到的一件事情。那让大家可以认识我们，认识台湾。
Lin also took center stage at the Summer Games because of questions about her gender. Despite having competed in women's boxing for years, Lin was disqualified from a single event in 2023 after failing an undisclosed test given by the now discredited International Boxing Association. Lin had since been cleared to compete by the International Olympic Committee and, with the support of her coach, pushed through the noise to Olympic glory.
台上的事情台上解决嘛，那在台上可以交给我去解决。那台下我要特别感谢我的教练。 他很辛苦，很努力，然后帮我承担了很多事情。那我在这边要特别的感谢他，帮我扛下了所有。那也请各位帮我给教练一个最热烈的掌声，可以吗？
Lin was joined by boxers Wu Shiyi and Chen Lianqing, who each won bronze at the Olympics.
谢谢大家在这次比赛当中，那么支持我们台湾的选手，不管是哪一个项目，就是会继续加油努力，希望大家继续支持拳击，喜欢拳击。
Taiwan won 7 medals at this year's Games, 2 gold and 5 bronze. While it's fewer than the haul from the Tokyo Olympics, many in the country still view it as a significant achievement. The haul also marks several historic firsts: the country's first gold in boxing, and the first time it has won 3 medals in the sport.
And now that the athletes have returned to Taiwan, they need to recover from the pressure and excitement from the Paris Summer Games, and then regain focus, and then overcome trials that lead up to the Olympics in LA in 2028. Chris Ma and Sandy Chi in Taoyuan for TaiwanPlus.
Coming up after the break, angry residents in central Taiwan say plans for a manure plant near their homes stink.
For more stories from here in Honolulu, Hawaii, and around the world, make sure to visit us on social media.
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. A crowd has rushed to City Hall in central Taiwan as a protest over a proposed pig manure facility grew out of control. Some of the roughly 300 people fell to the ground as protesters pushed through a police line. Plans for the facility in Changhua's Shihu Township have moved forward despite local opposition. Officials say the facility will use only 3 kilometers of public pipeline, but residents say the pollution it would produce would affect multiple villages. Changhua County has agreed to hold further public hearings. Summers in Taiwan's northern cities are feeling hotter than the rest of the country. As city planners work to curb the north's expanding heat islands, the government is also going after employers who don't offer their workers a proper shelter on especially hot days. Wesley Lewis reports.
Summers in Taipei are getting hotter. That's what urban development experts say. They've identified heat islands, areas that experience higher temperatures, in northern Taiwan's densely populated cities. And they say they are expanding.
台北、新北跟桃园的这个热岛已经透过2个盆地还有大汉溪的这个河谷已经连接在一起，要透过跨区域、跨城市的这个治理共同去解决高温化的问题。
Officials from the Environment, Health, and Labor Ministries held a joint seminar to address the rising temperatures. The Environment Ministry says temperatures in Taipei may increase by another 0.5 degrees to 2 degrees Celsius in the next 20 years, which they say could pose a threat to public health.
世界卫生组织的资料，它从2000年初2000到2004的有关高温相关的死亡的话，我们最近2017到2020年的增加了85%，其实对我们的冲击是非常非常大的。
The Labor Ministry says they'll fine employers more than $9,000 if they fail to provide workers with shelter when the heat index hits the highest level. The Taipei city government has also invested in infrastructure projects to provide residents with more shade and ventilation.
基地里面的水率的降温，还有我们基地里面建筑物的节能减碳，整体的都市的绿色基盘。
As human activity exacerbates the effects of climate change, Taiwan's government says it's pushing for more green energy. But think tank Ember says over 80% of Taiwan's energy still comes from fossil fuels, despite the country's 2050 net zero emission goal. For now, as summer temperatures in and around Taipei continue to rise, residents are advised to stay hydrated and avoid prolonged exposure to the sun on hot days. Klein Wong and Wesley Lewis for TaiwanPlus.
Record levels of rain are drenching northeastern Japan after Tropical Storm Maria made landfall on Monday. Parts of Japan's Iwate Prefecture saw flooding and landslides that leveled at least one home and forced a popular tourist attraction to close. Flights from the area were canceled and rail lines were partly suspended. The government says transportation services should be back to normal on Tuesday. Ukraine's top military commander claims Kyiv has taken control of 1,000 square kilometers of Russian land in their cross-border offensive. Colonel General Alexander Syrsky said Ukrainian forces will continue to push forward into the Kursk region as Moscow struggles to repel the incursion. In a televised meeting with top security officials, Russian President Vladimir Putin vowed to respond, saying Ukraine is trying to improve its negotiating power and undermine Moscow's stability.
Противник, безусловно, получит достойный ответ, а все цели, стоящие перед нами, вне всяких сомнений, будут достигнуты.
A new report released by Human Rights Watch details the violence and upheaval pressuring Myanmar's Muslim Rohingya minority as civil war rages there. It reveals a stateless community caught between military junta forces and armed resistance groups. Recent satellite imagery shows Rohingya villages and neighborhoods burned to the ground. For more, reporter Rick Glauert spoke to Brian Lau from Human Rights Watch.
Could you tell us the situation in Rakhine State in Western Myanmar at the moment?
We're seeing a severe deterioration in the human rights situation in Rakhine State over the last year or so. Really, the situation started to get significantly worse in November last year when an unofficial ceasefire between the ethnic Rakhine Arakan army and the Myanmar military broke down. Since then, we've seen the Arakan army gain control over more than the majority of the state. But in the process, we've seen indiscriminate and unlawful targeted attacks directly on civilians. This includes wide-scale use of airstrikes by the Myanmar military, but we've also expressed concerns about the Arakan Army's conduct and whether it's taken adequate precautions in terms of protecting civilians, in particular the Rohingya minority, which lives predominantly in the northern townships of Rakhine State.
This area, Rakhine State, has been racked by violence for years, if not decades, and made headlines around 2017 when the Rohingya population was persecuted. How is the violence that's racking this area different to what we saw in the past?
Right. So I think it's important to recognize that the Rohingya, who are a stateless Muslim minority in Myanmar, they've been persecuted for decades by the Myanmar military. In 2017, we saw acts of genocide committed as part of the military's so-called clearance operation that caused more than 700,000 people to flee to Bangladesh, where they remain today. What's different about the current violence is that this is certainly the moment that we've been most concerned about the Rohingya since 2017. As this time they are really caught between the two sides. On the one side, the ethnic Arakan army, and on the other side, the Myanmar military.
Could you tell us a bit about the situation for civilians across the country 3.5 years after the military took power in a coup?
We continue to see civilians across Myanmar, in a dire situation. On the one hand, they can be targeted by the Myanmar military's airstrikes, many of which are indiscriminate at any point in time. In addition, we're also seeing a really awful humanitarian crisis with massive underfunding of the UN response and really serious obstacles to actually getting assistance to large parts of the country. With almost 3 million people displaced across Myanmar, that's a huge amount of humanitarian need for a country that even before the coup struggled to deliver essential services to its population.
That was Bryony Lau of Human Rights Watch talking to reporter Rick Glauert about the deteriorating situation in Myanmar's Rakhine State. Facing forced conscription from the ruling junta and violence from the militia fighting it, many of Myanmar's Rohingya minority are choosing to flee. Bryn Thomas reports.
On May 24th, Saifur Rahman and his family found themselves among the thousands of Rohingya fleeing into the night as their homes burned down. He says his village in western Myanmar's Rakhine State was set alight by the anti-government Arakan Army, or AA, after they seized it from the country's ruling junta. Saifur says his brother was shot and killed and his parents are missing and presumed dead. Months later, he and his wife have joined the nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees living in deteriorating conditions in neighboring Bangladesh. The attack in May on their settlement in the town of Buridang was part of the latest wave of violence targeting Rohingya. Since 2012, the mostly Muslim minority group has been persecuted by every government that's ruled them. In 2017, a crackdown by the former Buddhist-majority democratic government saw thousands killed and hundreds of thousands more displaced in a campaign the UN described as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. When that government was overthrown in 2021, a civil war broke out and the ruling junta forces began forcing Rohingya men and children to fight for them. The Arakan Army, one of the many ethnic militias fighting the government, proved no better when they captured Buridang in May.
And then on the 17th of May, quite early in the day, the AA began informing people that they could not stay in Buridang and they needed to leave. And of course, a lot of the Rohingya, particularly with the lessons of 2017, where they know that if you leave a home, you don't return.
The AA denies burning the village when the Rohingya inhabitants refused to leave and said the fires were started by government bombs. But their version of events doesn't add up.
We have not been able to verify these accounts or of individuals saying that the AA started the fires. We strongly suspect that is the case. Because, again, they were the only armed actors in the town at the time.
The fog of the ongoing civil war is proving to be ample cover for those committing violence against the Rohingya. And when the war ends, it seems unlikely that any of the factions would protect their rights. And so, many Rohingya are left with no choice but to leave.
But
with their lives as refugees in Bangladesh also under threat, Rohingya people continue to face an uncertain future. James Lin and Bryn Thomas for TaiwanPlus.
Thanks for joining us on TaiwanPlus News. You can visit our website or follow our social media for more stories from us. Finally, we bring you these highlights from the Kite Park World Championships in the United States. I'm Philip Brossard. Take care, and we'll see you next time.